welcome to season 7 of CarmelCast. And this season, as you know from previous episodes, probably that we're doing a special episodes on the works of St. Therese. And this is in a special way too to prepare for her 150th anniversary of her birth that begins on January 2nd, 2023. And so we want to just take this time to go deeper into each of her works and unfold a little bit the riches that she has to offer us. And so for this episode, we have the great privilege and honor of having Father Donald Kinney, Father Donald of St. Therese, who joins us from Oakville, California, from our house of prayer there, from the California, Arizona province of Discalced Carmelite Friars. And Father Donald has been a Carmelite since 1980, so 42 years. So praise God for his service. And he is actually the translator of the poetry of St. Therese that we have in our ICS editions of her poetry. And so we thought, what better person to talk to and share about St. Therese's poetry than Father Donald, who knows St. Therese, who knows her poetry, and really who's been carried by her in so many ways in his own vocation. And so welcome, Father Donald.
Thank you, Father Michael Joseph. I'm very happy to be here to speak a little about the poetry of St. Therese. It's been 26 years since I translated the poetry. It's nice to come back to it these days as I've been delving into her poetry again, which meant so much to me and in my life. I really can't separate translating this book from my vocation. When I was 20, I spent my junior year in Paris. I was a French major, and I fell in love with Paris. I lived with a French family there, and I went back to Paris for 2 more years after I graduated from college and studied French on, and then I came back to this country and got a doctorate in French. But in all my studies of French literature, my specialty was French of the 19th and 20th centuries. I had never heard of St. Therese. I had never heard of Story of a Soul. So after I left, I had been teaching at the University of the Pacific in Stockton for 2 years. And after then, I came into the Catholic Church. I won't tell you about my conversion, but a woman in my new parish was French. And she gave me a book. She said, "Donald, there's a book I think you might like to read." And I had never heard of St. Therese. I had never heard of that book. But on the second page, by the second page, I was completely conquered. And I say, there's some books that we read and close and put aside. There are other books that we open and never close again. And St. Therese's Story of a Soul has been that for me. I knew right away, even though St. Therese never talks about the Discalced Carmelite Friars, I knew she wanted me to be one and that God wanted me to be one. And it turned out that I entered Carmel. I was living out in California. I entered Carmel 6 months after I entered the church. And then in our novitiate in San Jose, they have a wonderful Carmelite library, and I was able to go deep into her other works after Story of a Soul, which I admire so much. Father John Clark's translation, he really has an impeccable translation. He was very gifted. So I read the plays, and I read the prayers, and I read the poetry of St. Therese, and was entranced by them, and I wanted to translate them. I had a new assignment, and I had a little time there from my other ministry, and I began translating the poetry of St. Therese. And I knew that I am not a poet person. I'm a novel person. In literature, that's how you talk about yourself. And I am a novel person. So I knew that I couldn't translate St. Therese's poetry to rhyme, or that it would lose something. So Father Kieran Kavanagh was a good advisor to me before I began translating, and he advised me to look for a certain poetic sense in St. Therese's writings, and that's what I did. But the main reason I translated St. Therese's poetry is for the presentations of each poem and for the introduction and for the footnotes. And you may think this is very picayune, but the introductions to each poem and the footnotes are fascinating and give us whole new insights into St. Therese's poetry and to her life and to her spirituality that I certainly had never seen before. People think that I wrote the presentations to each poem and to the Father Daniel Chowning translated the introduction to the whole book. But I really recommend the presentations to each poem and the footnotes. And when I would translate, and it's probably this way for most translators, you really go deep into the author's thought to think about, to sift, to ponder, to pray with each word. And it was really quite a spiritual experience for me. And there were many times when I would feel St. Therese's presence with me, she guiding or directing me to choose this word or rather than that word, and whole new insights into her spirituality. So it was a wonderful experience. I didn't say once I entered and we had to choose a religious title, I'm like you, Father Michael Joseph, I chose of St. Therese. And then when it came time for me to be ordained, when I was a deacon, I was assigned to our parish of St. Therese in Alhambra. And our pastor, I had been a deacon a while and we needed to choose a date for the ordination, he sent quite a few dates to the Archbishop of Los Angeles to choose a date to come, and the Archbishop chose October 1st, and that was in 1988. But another very personal connection with St. Therese is that I have, my conversion to the Catholic Church was very difficult on my parents, my family. And after I was ordained in 1996, it was the beginning of the centenary year of the death of St. Therese. And right before that time, the end of September in 1996, my father had some very serious strokes. And I flew home to Georgia to be with him. And he died on October 1st that morning. And that was a tremendous grace for me. And I mentioned it to my mother just a few minutes after my father died, and mother said she realized too what an extraordinary, how unusual that was. So, like so many of us, Saint Therese has been such a wonderful part of my life, and it's nice to pick up her poetry again and to talk about it a little with you today.
Yes. Oh, thank you for that witness, Father Donald. That's really a powerful testimony, and I think just seeing how Therese had become such a close friend to you, had so surrounded your life, your vocation, your faith life, and I think maybe part of the reason is because she knew that you were going to work for her as well, that she had great plans for this because the poetry has become tremendous, and I think what maybe some people don't know is this poetry is the fruit of years of research on the French side, making the centenary edition of her works. And so you have all this research that went into it, and so many great historical so much great historical information that tells us more about her life, her spirituality, as you say, are in those introductions, in the footnotes. And so that had never been offered in English before, so this the riches that all these scholars had been doing, had been developing, it was now brought to the English-speaking world thanks to Father Donald.
This is an interesting story of something that happened to me while I was translating the poetry. I started about 1991, and it took 4 years. I think I went a year over my contract, and everybody at ICS was very indulgent to let me take my time. But in 1993, our provincial, Father Gerald Werner, asked me to represent our province at a formation meeting outside Munich, Germany. And I went to that, but I also got permission to spend 2 weeks in France, 1 week with the French family that I had lived with for those 3 years, and with whom I'm still in touch. But then I got to go to Lisieux for a week. And I got permission, we wrote ahead of time for me to visit the little house on the property of the Carmel of Lisieux, where all their archives are kept. And I had written them that I was translating the poetry, and there was a young woman working there, and she welcomed me, and then the prioress came out, Sister Marie-Lucille, and she brought several big albums, like photo albums. You're not allowed to see the manuscripts, but they had everything beautifully photocopied in the original colors, and all the different drafts and versions with St. Therese's calligraphy. And it was very moving to see. St. Therese wrote her first poem in 1893 when she was 20. It's called The Divine Dew, D-E-W, referring to the Eucharist. And she wrote it for an unusual reason. One sister in the community had asked her to do that, Sister Therese of St. Augustine. Now, if you know St. Therese's community well, you'll know that Sister Therese of St. Augustine was the sister whom St. Therese had the most difficulty getting along with. She wrote in Story of a Soul in manuscript C, the last part of her autobiography, "There is in the community a sister who displeases me in everything, in her ways, her words, her character. Everything is very disagreeable." She underlined very disagreeable to me. But then she said, "I set out to do for this sister what I would do for the person I love the most." So Sister Therese of St. Augustine asked her to write the poem, and St. Therese said, "I don't know if this is God's will." And Sister Therese of St. Augustine said, "I'll tell you how you know if it's God's will. Begin it, and if you can do it, it's God's will." And so she did, and what she wrote is awkward and a beginner's poem, but still she was launched on her way. But she didn't come back to poetry for another year and 3 months. And in that time, in 3 years, the last 3 years and 3 months of her life, she wrote 53 poems, most of them when she was very ill with tuberculosis and when she was in the dark night. She has this to say about her poetry in Story of a Soul. When she was very ill, she says, "If you judge by the little poems I've composed this year, I seem a soul filled with consolations. But when I sing of the happiness of heaven, I feel no joy in this. I simply sing what I want to believe." There was a great act of faith in what she was doing. One thing that comes forth that very strongly when you read the poems of St. Therese is what a hard worker she was. Not only all these poems, 53 poems in the last 3 years and 3 months of her life, but in January 1896, the sisters had just gone through a very rigorous weather, no heat in the monastery. And it was Mother Agnes, the prioress, St. Therese's blood sister Pauline, who was celebrating her feast day on January 21st. And St. Therese, at First Vespers, the evening before the feast of St. Agnes, St. Therese came with her little black copybook, which was the first part of what we now know as Story of a Soul, the first part of one of the greatest treasures of modern spiritual literature. And she put it on the prioress's stall and went to her place in the choir. And she never mentioned it again. She never mentioned it to Mother Agnes. Have you read my book? What did you think of it? She never mentioned it again. And Mother Agnes was busy. She had a lot to do as prioress. So she took this great spiritual treasure and stuck it in the back of a drawer and didn't open it until over a year later, when St. Therese was already very ill. And then she read it and realized what a treasure she had there. But on this January 20th, first Vespers of the feast of St. Agnes, St. Therese presented Mother Agnes with the beginning of Story of the Soul, which St. Therese had begun 13 months earlier. She also wrote a beautiful poem, The Responses of St. Agnes, for Mother Agnes's feast day. And it's based on the antiphons of the Liturgy of the Hours, some of the antiphons that we have now in our Liturgy of the Hours. But that was not enough. She had also written a play for the novices to put on for Mother Agnes called The Flight into Egypt. And that involved a lot of work and memorizing lines. Some of it was in verse and some of it was in prose. Many times St. Therese would compose a poem during the day. The introduction to the poetry says that most of the time she would find a melody that she liked, usually from a hymn, and then she would compose the poem in her head, and she wouldn't be able to write it down. The nuns were so strict about their timetable that she wasn't able to write it down until her hour of free time at night from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And then she would write everything down. And the most beautiful example of that is my favorite poem, Living on Love, Vivre d'amour. And I'll give a little parenthesis here. Maybe the phrase that I had the most difficulty deciding on for a translation was this, Vivre d'amour. The old version, several old translations that I had read would say living on love. But to me that just didn't sound natural. And then I thought of living on love. We hear that a saint lives on the Eucharist, or sometimes you'll hear a mother say, "Oh, my son lives on peanut butter." So I thought living on love would be very nice. And St. Therese, this was on Mardi Gras of 1896. She's already very ill, but it was Ash Wednesday came the next day, and then after Lent, the Easter season, and that's when St. Therese coughed up blood to help it put this in the timetable of her life. But all the nuns would make, on Mardi Gras, they would make a day of recollection before the Blessed Sacrament in the chapel, and they would offer that for the sins of Carnival, of Mardi Gras. And St. Therese was there, and she wrote 14 of these 15 stanzas in her head during that day. And then that night, in her free time or free hour, she put them all down on paper. One stanza she wrote it in her head in the infirmary. And she said, I'm amazed that I can still write, but these are the 15 stanzas of living on love. She was a very hard worker. As I said, all these different compositions that she was able to do. Usually she would write a poem to commemorate a clothing or a profession or one of the older sisters' jubilee. But very often she would write to encourage for a sister or to teach. She wrote a poem for her spiritual brothers. She would write a poem about combat, Joan of Arc, saving souls. She wrote about the love of Jesus, several poems for the Sacred Heart. Remember, her oldest sister was Sister Marie of the Sacred Heart, and several of the poems that St. Therese wrote were for her older sister. But her poems tend to be more daring and luminous as the night gets darker in her soul, as she's more, as she feels more distant from Jesus. Her poems become more radiant, and this is a tremendous act of faith. When you compare the footnotes and the introductions and the different versions, when you can compare the letters and the last conversations and story of a soul and the poetry, you come up with very beautiful conclusions. And you can do that too in your reading of St. Therese's works. St. Therese is very visual in her writings, especially in her poetry. She'll talk about Jesus' face or his smile. Now she says in Story of a Soul, I never had a vision, I never heard Jesus speak, but I feel that he's within me. So it's an act of faith for her to say that she talks about his eyes or his smile, and when she's really daring at the end of her life, she'll talk about running into his arms or giving him a kiss. And one of the most truly amazing verses of her poem, she talks about Jesus. She'll be in his arms, and she'll talk about him giving her a kiss. That's great daring. And she would never let most of the nuns in the community read that because they would be very shocked. Now, St. Elizabeth of the Trinity, who's influenced by St. Therese in so many ways, would never write. She wrote poetry too, quite a bit of poetry, but she would never be as visual to talk about the face or the eyes or the smile of Jesus. St. Elizabeth of the Trinity is auditive. Remember, she was a virtuoso pianist, and she says she was such a good listener. And she says in her prayer to the Trinity, oh Jesus, I want to spend my life listening to you. That was very different from St. Therese's spirituality. And that point that I just made about St. Elizabeth being auditive and St. Therese being visual, I borrow that from Father Conrad de Meester, whom I met, who was also a wonderful Carmelite and a tremendous scholar like Bishop Guy Gaucher for our order. I'll give you just two more examples of her poetry, verses that touched me very much. At the end of her life, 2 months before she died, when she was in the infirmary, and Jesus seemed so far away from her when she was suffering so much from tuberculosis, coughing up blood. She had gangrene of the intestines and couldn't eat. She couldn't hold down her food. She had splitting headaches. In the summertime, she would sweat so much that the nun said she would sweat through a mattress. Yet Jesus seemed so far away, and she never mentioned it to the sisters except to those who were closest to her. But in one poem that she wrote to her heroine, Joan of Arc, in 2 months before she died in May 1897, she wrote, at the bottom of a black dungeon, Joan, there you are laden with heavy chains. And the sister who received that poem, when the sisters in community sang that poem, they had no idea that she was describing how she felt at the bottom of a black dungeon laden with heavy chains. But those are details that we would never know about her if we didn't have that particular poem. And the last poem that I'll quote is one that many people like. It's her last poem, Why I Love You, O Mary. she said in the infirmary, I still have one thing to do before I die. I want to write a poem about Mary. And this, she called it, Why I Love You, O Mary. And it's very touching, and I think even in prose, it comes out very eloquent. And this is the last stanza. She wrote, You who came to smile at me in the morning of my life. Remember when she was 10 and she had a very mysterious illness that doctors couldn't diagnose, and she looked up at the statue of Our Lady of the Smile that had been so important in her family. And the smile of the statue seemed to radiate and come alive, and Thérèse was cured. So she says, You who came to smile at me in the morning of my life, come smile at me again, Mother. It's evening now. Maybe she needs a smile like that right now. She said, I no longer fear the splendor of your supreme glory. With you I've suffered. She admits it. She said, with you I've suffered, and now I want to sing on your lap. What daring. Could you say that? Right now, I want to sing on your lap, Mary, why I love you, and to go on saying that I am your child. And that's how one of the ways St. Therese wants to spend her heaven, is to be on Mary's lap, thanking Mary, thanking Jesus, and thanking them that she is their child. And she signs this poem. Most of her poems she didn't sign, but this one she signs La Petite Thérèse, the little Thérèse. And she didn't say Thérèse, but the little Thérèse. It's almost as if she's objectifying herself, which again is very touching. So I hope you can see how excited I am about the poetry of St. Therese, and how I hope that you can read it if you haven't read it before. Read the introductions to each poem. Look at the footnotes. When they refer you to her letters, or to her plays, go there and make those connections. And believe me, you will feel a tremendous kinship, a warmth, a love for her. She will speak to you as only she can. It's a whole new world that one enters with the poetry of St. Therese.
Yes.
I'll hold this up for you. And this is the complete works in French. But I certainly, this has meant so much to me. I've worn out this version already, and I hope that you will read it too.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Father Donald. And I think what a great witness and a great enthusiasm that you have of St. Therese, her poetry, after these years of studying her and translating her. And our hope is that other people too can kind of catch the bug and delve into her works. You know, this is where you meet the real St. Therese. And it's not only in her autobiography, her poetry expresses other aspects that we can't maybe get in another place. And so just to encourage everyone, pick up her poetry, let it speak to you, let it become your prayer as well. And just discover the beautiful riches that St. Therese really has to offer us. So thank you again, Father Donald, and we hope that we'll have you in future episodes. So thank you for your great sharing and your experience and your witness.